I noticed the way they all looked at me as I set down the turkey at the center of the table. My father's eyes, cloudy with medication and age, briefly met mine with confusion. He didn't remember asking me to host Thanksgiving this year. He probably didn't remember calling me at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago, panicking because he couldn't find his glasses that were sitting on his nightstand. He definitely didn't remember that I was the one who found them, who calmed him down, who stayed until dawn. But my siblings remembered exactly what they wanted to remember. And what they had apparently decided to remember was that I was stealing from our father. "Emily, this is quite the spread," my older sister Diane said, her voice honey-sweet with the special tone she reserved for gatherings where appearances mattered more than truth. "You must have spent a fortune. I hope it wasn't Dad's fortune." My brother Mark snickered from behind his wine glass, a $300 bottle he'd brought from his collection, but had almost certainly charged to our father's credit card that he insisted on managing. I just smiled. "Let's just enjoy dinner. Dad, do you want to say grace?" My father, once the commanding presence whose approval we all fought for, now looked small in his chair at the head of the table. The stroke last year had taken more than his mobility. It had cracked open a door for my siblings to walk through, straight to his bank accounts and property. "I think I'll say it," Mark interjected, reaching for Dad's hand and mine, completing the circle around the table. "After all, I handle most of Dad's affairs these days." I let him lead the prayer, listening to him thank God for family, for health, for prosperity. I noticed he didn't thank God for truth. Or justice. But that was fine. Those weren't God's responsibility today. They were mine. I'd spent the last 11 months caring for our father while my siblings managed his life from a comfortable distance. Mark lived 2 hours away but only appeared for financial discussions. Diane lived 20 minutes away but was always swamped with her part-time job at her husband's already staffed insurance company. Meanwhile, I had put my graphic design career on pause after Dad's stroke. I moved back to my childhood bedroom at 37, cancelled my apartment lease, and stored most of my possessions. I took Dad to every doctor's appointment, managed his medications, cooked his meals, and helped him with physical therapy exercises that had slowly rebuilt his strength. And somehow, over those months, I had become the enemy. "So Dad," Diane said, cutting into her turkey with surgical precision, "how's that new investment Mark found for you? The one that's supposed to double your returns?" Dad looked up, fork paused midway to his mouth. "Investment?" Mark jumped in. "It's going great, Dad. Just like I told you last week. We are seeing excellent early returns." He shot a glance at Diane that I wasn't supposed to see. "Emily doesn't need to worry about those details." "What details would those be, Mark?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "The details of the $50,000 you transferred from Dad's account to something called Pinnacle Opportunities that has no registration with the SEC? Those details?" Mark's face flushed dark red, a vein pulsing in his temple the way it always did when he was caught. "Some things never change, not since we were kids and I caught him stealing from my piggy bank." "You've been monitoring Dad's accounts?" Diane gasped, her hand fluttering to her chest like a wounded bird. "Someone should be," I replied evenly, serving myself some cranberry sauce. "Especially since he doesn't remember authorizing half these transactions." "That's ridiculous," Mark sputtered. "Dad and I discuss everything." "Tell her, Dad." Our father looked between us, his eyes confused, searching for the right answer to keep the peace at his table. That had always been his way: avoid conflict, smooth things over, trust that his children would work it out. But his children had grown into adults who knew how to exploit that trust. "I'm sure Mark is doing what's best," he finally said, the words clearly rehearsed, planted there by my brother during his brief, strategic visits. "Of course he is," Diane soothed, patting Dad's hand. "Emily's just upset because she's had to put her life on hold. It's understandable, but it doesn't justify accusations." I took a long sip of water, letting the cold calm me. "How's the bathroom remodel at your house going, Diane? The Italian marble must have been expensive." Her fork clattered against the plate. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just making conversation." I smiled. "Dad mentioned he gave you money for a medical expense. I assumed it was for that bathroom you've been posting about on Instagram. The one with his credit card conveniently visible on the counter in your selfie." The table fell silent except for the sound of Dad's fork against his plate as he continued eating, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. I don't have to justify helping my father manage his money, Diane said finally, her voice clipped. Neither do I, Mark added. In fact, I've been meaning to talk to you, Emily. Some of the caregiving expenses you've been charging seem excessive. And there it was. The trap they'd been laying for months, the whispers I'd overheard in late-night phone calls they didn't know I could hear from the hallway outside Dad's room. You've been telling Dad I'm stealing from him. It wasn't a question. We're concerned, Diane said, not denying it. You've had access to his checkbook, his cards. You live in his house, eat his food. I take care of him every day, I cut in. Every single day while you two swoop in for the glory visits, bringing gifts you bought with his money, making promises you never keep. That's enough. Mark slammed his hand on the table, making the glasses jump. We are not going to sit here and be accused by someone who. Who what, Mark? I interrupted. Someone who gave up her apartment, her job, her relationship to move back home and care for Dad? Someone who drives him to every appointment, manages every medication, helps him shower and dress when he can't do it himself? That someone? Dad was looking between us now, distress clear on his face. This was exactly what I didn't want to happen, but my siblings had forced my hand. I think, I said, standing up, that it's time for dessert. And a little presentation I've prepared. I walked to the sideboard where my laptop sat closed next to the pumpkin and pecan pies. I opened it, connected it to the TV mounted on the dining room wall, and turned to face my family. I wasn't planning to do this today, I said quietly. I wanted one normal holiday. But since you've decided to accuse me of theft at Thanksgiving dinner, I think we need to clear the air. The first slide appeared on the screen. A simple timeline, starting with Dad's stroke last December. This is a record of the past year, I explained. Every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every medication change. I clicked to the next slide. And this is a record of who was present for each one. The bar graph was stark in its clarity. My name appeared at nearly 100%. Mark and Diane barely registered, thin slivers of color at the bottom of the chart. That's not fair, Diane protested. We have our own families, our own lives. So did I said simply, clicking to the next slide. This one showed Dad's financial accounts, the steady decline since my siblings had taken over management. And here, I continued, are some interesting transactions. I clicked through images of credit card statements, highlighting charges for restaurants in cities Dad hadn't visited, luxury goods he would never use, services he didn't need. That's private information. Mark stood up now too, his face mottled with anger. It's Dad's private information, I corrected him. Information he has every right to know about. Information I have documented for the past 11 months while you two have been systematically draining his retirement. I moved to the next set of images. Security camera footage from inside Dad's house, cameras I had installed after noticing things going missing. Here's Diane removing paintings from Dad's study during her last visit. The footage clearly showed my sister carefully wrapping Mom's favorite landscape painting and carrying it out to her car. And here's Mark going through Dad's desk, taking his collection of rare coins. You've been spying on us? Diane's outrage would have been convincing if I hadn't spent the last year documenting her lies. I've been protecting our father, I corrected her. Which is what you two claim to be doing, but the evidence suggests otherwise. I turned to Dad, whose eyes were fixed on the screen, watching as his children betrayed his trust in high definition. Dad, I'm sorry to do this today, but they've been telling you I've been stealing from you, and that's simply not true. My voice softened. I've documented every penny I've spent of yours, for groceries, for medications, for the house. This one showed Dad's financial accounts, the steady decline since my siblings had taken over management. And here, I continued, are some interesting transactions. I clicked through images of credit card statements, highlighting charges for restaurants in cities Dad hadn't visited, luxury goods he would never use, services he didn't need. That's private information. Mark stood up now too, his face mottled with anger. It's Dad's private information, I corrected him. Information he has every right to know about. Information I have documented for the past 11 months while you two have been systematically draining his retirement. I moved to the next set of images. It's all here and it's all legitimate. I clicked to another slide showing my meticulous accounting, every expense categorized and justified. Meanwhile, in the past year, Mark has transferred over $150,000 from your accounts to his personal accounts and questionable investments. Diane has charged over $60,000 to your credit cards for her home renovations, vacations, and shopping sprees. The silence in the room was deafening. Dad looked at his plate, then at each of us, his expression impossible to read through the confusion that so often clouded his eyes now. "Is this true?" he finally asked, looking at Mark and Diane. "Dad, Emily is manipulating you," Mark said quickly. "She's always been jealous of our success. She's trying to turn you against us because she has nothing else in her life. The old me would have been hurt by that. The me from a year ago might have crumbled, might have apologized, might have backed down just to keep the peace. But that version of me died during the long nights of caring for Dad, during the endless doctor visits, during the silent mornings when no one called to check if we needed anything. I've filed reports with the bank's fraud department," I said calmly. "I've consulted with an elder law attorney. Everything is documented, and if necessary, I'm prepared to go to the police." "You wouldn't dare," Diane whispered, her perfect Thanksgiving dinner crumbling around her. "I already have," I replied. "The reports are filed. I've given you both multiple opportunities to come clean, to repay what you've taken. You chose instead to vilify me to our vulnerable father." I walked around the table to stand beside Dad, placing my hand gently on his shoulder. "Dad doesn't remember everything clearly these days, but he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to be protected. You've always thought you were better than us," Mark spat. "Always the perfect daughter, the martyr. Well, congratulations. You've won Dad's sympathy. I hope it was worth destroying the family." I looked at him for a long moment, this brother who had once taught me to ride a bike, who had defended me against bullies in elementary school, who had somehow become someone I no longer recognized. "I didn't destroy our family, Mark. Greed did that." I turned to Diane. "Selfishness did that. I'm just making sure Dad is safe from both." Dad reached up and took my hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. When I looked down, his eyes were clearer than they had been all day. "I remember," he said quietly. "Not everything, not always. But enough. I remember who sits with me when I'm afraid in the middle of the night. I remember who makes sure I take my pills, who helps me when my legs won't work right." He looked at Mark and Diane. "And I remember who doesn't." Diane's perfect makeup couldn't hide the shock on her face. Mark seemed to deflate in his chair. "Dad, we can explain," Diane began, but Dad held up his hand. "No more explanations. No more lies." His voice, frail as it had become, carried the authority that had once ruled our childhood home. "Emily has shown me the evidence over the past few weeks. I just couldn't believe it until I saw your faces when she confronted you." This was news to my siblings, whose heads swiveled to me in unison. "You think I would blindside Dad with this?" I asked them. "I've been gradually showing him the evidence at his pace when he's having good days. Today was just for you too." "What happens now?" Mark asked, all the bluster gone from his voice. Dad straightened in his chair, and for a moment I saw echoes of the man he used to be. "Now, you both repay every cent you've taken. Every penny. Or Emily will take this to the authorities, with my full support. And," I added, "you'll sign over your financial authority to a neutral third party, the trustee I've already located who specializes in elder financial protection. You'll have supervised visitation with Dad until you've earned back his trust." "Supervised?" Diane began, indignant. "Those are the terms," I cut her off. "Take them or face the consequences. Dad deserves better than what you've done to him." The rest of Thanksgiving dinner passed in a strained silence. The pies remained uncut on the sideboard. Mark and Diane left early, their perfect family holiday shattered by the truth they'd tried to bury. After they were gone, I sat with Dad in the living room, the remnants of our dinner still on the table behind us. I hadn't wanted to do it this way. I'd hoped they would realize what they were doing, would come to their senses without the public exposure. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, holding his hand. "I'm sorry it came to this." He looked at me with tired eyes that had seen nearly 8 decades of life, including the best and worst of his children. "You know, your mother always said you were the strongest of the 3. She was right." I felt tears welling up then, the emotions I'd held in check through the confrontation finally breaking free. "I miss her. She would have known how to handle this better than I did." Dad shook his head slowly. No, she would have done exactly what you did. Protected family at all costs, even from itself. We sat in silence for a while, the house quieter now without my siblings' voices, without the tension that had hummed in the air during dinner. What happens tomorrow? Dad finally asked. Tomorrow, I said, squeezing his hand, we have leftover turkey sandwiches. We watch football. We take your medicine on schedule. We do your exercises. We go on, just like we have been. And Mark and Diane? That's up to them, I said honestly. They can choose to make amends, to rebuild what they've broken. Or they can choose to stay angry. Either way, you'll be protected. Dad nodded, his eyelids growing heavy as the day's events and his medication took their toll. Thank you, he murmured, for being the one who stayed. As I helped him to bed later that evening, I thought about the many paths my life could have taken. The career I'd put on pause, the apartment I'd given up, the relationship that couldn't survive my absence. I thought about the choices my siblings had made, the ease with which they had rationalized their betrayal. And I realized that in the end, we all got exactly what we deserved. They got consequences. I got clarity. And Dad got the truth, painful as it was. The next morning, my phone was filled with texts from both Mark and Diane, alternating between angry accusations and tearful apologies. I set the phone aside without responding. They would have to sit with their choices for a while, just as I had sat with mine for the past year. I made Dad his favorite breakfast and helped him to his chair on the porch, where the late November sun cast long shadows across the yard. You know, he said as I adjusted his blanket, I think this might have been the most important Thanksgiving we've ever had. I looked at him, surprised. How so? Because for the first time in a long time, I'm actually feeling grateful, he replied. Grateful for the truth. Grateful for you. I smiled and sat down beside him, watching the neighbors cat stalk through the fallen leaves. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do for someone you love is to stand up for them, even when the people you're standing against are family. Especially then. If there's one lesson I've learned through all of this, it's that family isn't just about blood and shared history. It's about who stays when staying is hard. It's about who tells the truth when lies would be easier. It's about who protects you when you can't protect yourself. By those measures, I was the only family my father had left. And I was finally at peace with that. If you've been through something similar, know that you're not alone. Standing up against family exploitation takes tremendous courage, but sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do. Subscribe to hear more stories of family healing, boundary setting, and the complicated journey toward justice within our closest relationships. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes the most important victories aren't celebrated with cheers, but with quiet moments of truth that change everything.